Optimizing shank angle for improved running efficiency. It takes just a few seconds to make the change from heel to mid-foot striking during drills. The transformation from a large shank angle at touchdown, SAT, to the optimal 6 to 7 degree angle is similarly brief. However, the total change, to where all running is completed with an SAT of 6 to 7 degrees, can take several months, similar to the time frame sometimes associated with the change from heel to mid-foot striking, figure 7.1. As mentioned in Chapter 6, the reason for the long conversion period is not because it takes a long time to learn how to react with the ground in a different way. Most runners with a large SAT can reduce those lofty angles nearly instantly during drills. However, they often will not preserve the more minimal SAT when they change from carrying out the initial shank angle minimizing drills to regular running. Many will broaden SAT again as they move from drills to running, because a broad SAT is what their neuromuscular systems are accustomed to producing. The human neuromuscular system is not usually agreeable to sudden, complete changes in running kinematics, even when the capacity to make such alterations is present. We shouldn't be angry at our neuromuscular systems for this. After all, just as was the case with the change from heel to mid-foot striking, a severe reduction in SAT changes everything. When shank angle changes, the leg muscles and connective tissues begin working in completely different ways, and muscles that had been relatively inactive during big shank angle running, especially the calf muscles, suddenly begin carrying out a heavy load of work with each step. While it is highly beneficial to make the change from big SAT to 6 or 7 degree landings, an acute change can actually hurt running economy and increase the risk of injury in the short term. Going for an 8-mile run with a small SAT after years of running with a big SAT is a recipe for serious calf discomfort. Figure 7.1. It can take months for a runner to transform completely from A, a high SAT to B, a 6 or 7 degree SAT. Why is a sudden change in SAT such a bad idea, even though long-term reduction in shank angle is a fantastic concept? Hitting the ground with a more flexed knee and moving the foot back so that it strikes closer to a point under a runner's center of mass tends to change not just the shank angle, but also the way in which the foot hits the ground. Specifically, moving the foot closer to the body so that shank angle is smaller tends to push a runner toward mid-foot striking rather than heel striking, figures 7.2 and 7.3. If you doubt that this is the case, try a simple drill. Stand with fairly erect posture, with your feet directly under your shoulders and your knees soft, relaxed, and a little flexed, and then begin running in place. Do you notice how the mid-regions of your feet, or even the balls of your feet, are hitting the ground? Now try running in place with the same posture using a heel striking pattern. Do you notice how uncomfortable this is? Moving the feet back so that each impact with the ground occurs closer to a point under the center of the body tends to naturally produce a mid-foot landing pattern. Figure 7.4a and b. Figure 7.2. When a runner lands on her heel with a relatively straight leg, her SAT is usually quite large. Figure 7.3 making initial contact with the ground with a less straight leg, more flexion at the knee, and smaller SAT automatically pushes a runner away from heel striking and toward mid-foot landings. Figure 7.4 reducing shank angle at initial impact tends to naturally enforce a shift from A, heel striking, to B, mid-foot striking. Heel striking becomes too uncomfortable for the pattern to persist. All of this being true, we are left with a scenario similar to the one observed during the change from heel striking to mid-foot striking. The greater reliance on smaller shank angles and the associated move toward mid-foot striking reduces the vertical loading rate of force through the shank and entire rest of the leg. Use of more abbreviated shank angles is gentle on the knees and hips. This prevents the unmitigated effects of Isaac Newton's equal and opposite reactions from blasting the knees and hips with tremendous forces directly up the legs from the heels on each step. Smaller shank angles are comforting to the muscles and connective tissues of the shins too, because they reduce the eccentric control of slap-down work that the muscles, tendons, and ligaments must carry out when SAT is large and heel striking is dominant. Figure 7.5. Figure 7.5. After a heel strike, when the foot hits the ground, the shin muscles are working hard to control the foot while simultaneously being stretched. This eccentric action increases the risk of stress reactions in the tibia and fibula, as well as damage to the muscles and tendons of the shin. It is important to note that moving the foot back toward the body and reducing the SAT converts the calf muscles and Achilles tendon from lazy passengers during gait to the hardest-working members of the below-the-knee team. This has to be true because the ankle making a small shank angle begins to undergo dorsiflexion immediately after impact, with the top of the foot moving closer to the shin instead of away from it, as it does during the slap-down of the foot associated with a big SAT. As mentioned in Chapter 6, this dorsiflexion after touchdown places extra strain on the Achilles tendon and calf muscle complex, gastrocnemius and soleus, which must work together to control the strong dorsiflexion approximately 90 times per minute per ankle, assuming a decent cadence of 180 steps per minute, figures 7.6 and 7.7. Over the long term, it's good to ask the Achilles tendon and calf muscles to carry out more work per step because this additional work can gradually strengthen those key areas of the lower limbs. However, sudden jumps in work output, especially when performed 90 times per foot, can have a crippling effect on the Achilles tendon and calf muscles, producing soreness and tightness that can persist for days, or a significant calf injury which can last even longer. The problem associated with such an injury is not with low SAT or even with the increased reliance on midfoot striking, but rather with an overly dramatic and sudden transition from big to little SATs. As outlined in Chapter 6, transformations of form and training always require a slow and careful approach to minimize the risk of injury. Runners working toward smaller SATs should make a very gradual entry into this new form pattern, instead of an all-or-nothing approach over a short period. A gradual transition from large to 6 to 7 degree SAT is especially important for the high-volume runner. Runners who have a big SAT and are averaging 5 miles of running per week can probably immediately begin hitting 20% of their miles, about 1 mile per week, with low shank angles and no negative consequences. The runner who averages 70 miles per week, on the other hand, would be in trouble at 20%, 14 miles per week, at low shank angle, especially if most of the miles were covered in a single run. The calves, Achilles tendons, and metatarsal bones of the feet would be at heightened risk of injury. The change from expanded to smaller shank angles will produce significant benefits. See Table 7.1. Impact force loading rate in the leg, VALR, will decrease. The knees and hips will get a much-needed break, and braking forces during stance will be reduced. The time spent producing braking forces during stance will shorten, meaning more of your stance will be devoted to pushing you forward. Economy will improve, in part because of the reduced braking forces, as less energy and oxygen will be needed to overcome braking. Economy will also improve because of the shorter duration of the braking phase. This will reduce stance time, and thus the amount of oxygen utilized with each step to support the body. Propulsive forces will increase because the legs will become springier. Increased propulsive forces will lead to a higher performance potential. Risk of injury will be lower because of the lower force loading rate. Table 7.1. Factors associated with high versus low SAT. Force loading rate. High SAT leads to a high force loading rate, while a 6-7 degree SAT leads to a reduced force loading rate. Braking forces during stance. High SAT leads to high braking forces, while a 6-7 degree SAT leads to reduced braking forces. Time spent producing braking forces. High SAT results in a long time spent producing braking forces, while a 6-7 degree SAT results in a short time spent producing braking forces. Running economy. High SAT is associated with poor running economy, while a 6-7 degree SAT is associated with improved running economy. Oxygen required to overcome braking. High SAT requires high oxygen to overcome braking, while a 6-7 degree SAT requires reduced oxygen to overcome braking. Stance time. High SAT leads to longer stance time, while a 6-7 degree SAT leads to shorter stance time. Stride rate. High SAT is associated with a slower stride rate, while a 6-7 degree SAT is associated with a faster stride rate. Risk of injury. High SAT leads to a higher risk of injury, while a 6-7 degree SAT leads to a lower risk of injury. A key point to remember is that the runner with a big shank angle usually hits the ground with a relatively straight leg, with the landing foot well in front of the body. In contrast, the runner with a small shank angle hits the ground with the foot closer to the body and the body's center of mass, and with a softer and more flexed knee compared with heel striking. Small SATs provide milder landings, with impact force traveling up the leg at a lower speed. Running fast with high shank angles forces the runner to ram a leg into the ground at high speed with each step, while running quickly with low shank angles brings your feet back and allows your legs to work like the springier structures they were intended to be. Figure 7.8. If there remains any doubt that big shank angles put runners more at risk for injury than small shank angles, consider this scenario. You are running along a sidewalk at high speed and come to the end of the block. There, you must spring forward off of the curb and land on a cement roadway that is 2 feet or 0.6 meters below the top level of the curb. You are going to jump down onto the road at high velocity, and you must land on just 1 foot. Would you rather land on your heel, with your foot well out in front of you, and with a straight, rigid leg? Or would you rather land mid-footed, with your foot closer to being under your body and your knee flexed to absorb the impact shock? Which plan carries the greater risk of injury? Transitioning to small shank angles for efficient running. Figure 7.9, jogging barefoot helps runners learn to land mid-foot with low SATs. On the pages that follow, you will find drills to facilitate the transition from large to small SATs. They should be carried out barefoot at first to provide superior proprioception and therefore a better feeling for mid-foot striking and smaller shank angles. Figure 7.9. Developing this feeling will help sustain mid-foot landings and small SATs during training and races. All drill durations are measured in minutes. Phase 1. Barefoot. Activity 1. Walk in place with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 1 minute. Stance, soft, flexed knees. Activity 2. Jog in place with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 3 minutes. Stance, soft, flexed knees. Activity 3. Jog forward with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 3 minutes. Stance, soft, flexed knees and small steps. Conduct the drills before the main portion of your overall workout. Repeat the drills about 5 times per week for 2 weeks, or until you are completely certain that you can carry out all 3 activities with mid-foot landings and small SATs. Verify this by video analysis using a smartphone or camera capable of recording at 240 FPS or greater, along with an analysis app. You are then ready to move on to Phase 2. Phase 2. In running shoes. Activity 1. Walk in place with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 1 minute. Stance, soft, flexed knees. Activity 2. Jog in place with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 3 minutes. Stance, soft, flexed knees. Activity 3. Jog forward with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 3 minutes. Stance, soft, flexed knees and small steps. Complete the drills about 5 times per week for 2 weeks, or until you are completely certain that you can carry out all 3 activities with mid-foot landings and low shank angles while shod. Verify this by video analysis using a smartphone or camera capable of recording at 240 FPS or greater, along with an analysis app. You are then ready to move on to Phase 3. Phase 3. Barefoot. Activity 1. Jog in place with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 1 minute. Stance, soft, flexed knees. Activity 2. Jog forward with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 3 minutes. Stance, soft, flexed knees and small steps. Activity 3. Run forward with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 3 minutes. Stance, soft, flexed knees and longer steps. When running forward, move at medium to medium-hard intensity, somewhat like a half marathon to 10K race pace. Warm up properly before you carry out Phase 3. Complete the drills about 5 times per week for 2 weeks, or until you are completely certain that you can carry out all 3 activities with mid-foot landings and small shank angles while barefoot. Verify by video analysis using a smartphone or camera capable of recording at 240 FPS or greater, along with an analysis app. You are then ready to move on to Phase 4. Phase 4 in running shoes. Activity 1. Jog in place with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 1 minute. Stance, soft, flexed knees. Activity 2. Jog forward with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 3 minutes. Stance, soft, flexed knees and small steps. Activity 3. Run forward with mid-foot landing and a small SAT. Duration, 3 minutes. Stance, soft, flexed knees and longer steps. When running forward, move at medium to medium-hard intensity, somewhat like half marathon to 10K race pace or a little faster. Warm up properly before you carry out Phase 4. Complete the drills about 5 times per week for 2 weeks, or until you are completely certain that you can carry out all 3 activities with mid-foot landings and small SATs while shod in your regular training or racing shoes. Verify by video analysis using a smartphone or camera capable of recording at 240 FPS or greater, along with an analysis app. You are then ready to move on to more complicated drills described in subsequent chapters. These drills take 7 minutes per workout to complete. For the rest of your training session, including during the warm-up, gradually introduce more and more running with mid-foot landings and low SATs. For example, during the first week of drills, you may want to focus on running with mid-foot striking and low SATs for about 10% of your normal training time. The rest of the time, simply run normally. During the second week of drills, transition to running with mid-foot striking and small SATs for around 20% of your training time, and so on. Contrast run. A couple of times per week after an adequate warm-up, supplement the above drills with contrast runs, proceeding as follows. 1. Run at a moderate speed for approximately 50 meters with straight, stiff legs, with little knee flexion and the landing point well ahead of the body, large SAT. 2. Rest for a few moments, and then run 50 meters at a moderate speed with soft, slightly flexed knees. 3. Rest for a few moments, and then run 50 meters with straight, hard legs, landing on a heel with each step and with a large SAT. 4. Rest briefly, and then run 50 meters at a moderate speed with soft, slightly flexed knees, making sure that each landing occurs at the midfoot with a small SAT. 5. Repeat steps 1 through 4 2 more times. At first, make sure that the contrast running is carried out on a soft, forgiving surface, such as grass, sand, a gym floor, or a rubberized track. During each 50-meter segment, be aware of how different each running style feels, and how mid-foot striking with small shank angles leads to springier running with less discomfort and lower perceived effort. The transition from a large SAT to a 6 or 7 degree SAT will occur at different rates for individual runners. Some runners may make the transformation nearly instantly, while others might require several months. Regular performance of the drills described in this chapter will facilitate the transition. But remember that runners should not try to transition all running from a large SAT to a small SAT in a short period. The change should be made progressively to prevent injury to the Achilles tendon, calf muscles, and feet. As drills are completed week by week, an individual's running will gradually and progressively become more like the drills. Then, the transformation from large to small SATs will be complete.